thank you very much. So my job is to represent to you some of the thinking that goes into this program on statistical learning in the brain. And I gave you a slightly different title for the talk, which is how is it that the brain might, I guess I said how the brain, well, whatever. How does the brain, I'll give the brain a capital B, construct a world? And you'll see why I called it that as we go along. All right. So I'm very glad that Lars told the people in the program not to correct me, because I'm in a very strange position of representing to you a program, with this being my first day here in the program. But I know many of the people in the program, and what I'm really going to end up doing is trying to represent kind of a thread of thinking that we've sort of been, as a community, been following, well, I've been following since maybe the mid-90s onwards, but it sort of, much work has preceded that as well. And I'll try to lay out some of the thinking that's gone into it over that time, and hopefully we will have time to get to the modern day and talk a little bit about the kind of questions that we're asking at the moment. Right, so let us start. Let me get the drawings done quickly, because they will be horrible. So this is an attempt at a brain. Let's see, let's get an occipital pole in, temporal lobe, something like this. We'll put a cerebellum there, okay, something like that, alright? His brain. And down here is an attempt at a world. Let's start with maybe Africa. Alright, something like that. We've got a bit of Europe over here. It goes up over here. South America. Alright, whatever. Okay, there's our world. So, kind of a puzzle, sort of let me pose a primordial puzzle to you. Right. Let's say that we've got one of these artifacts that has appeared out of nowhere, and it has on its sensors. Right. So it has drawings. No, I won't draw them. It has sensors for light. That's an eye. It has sensors for sound. Interestingly enough, it has sensors for the different Fourier components for sound. That's a mechanical transduction that goes on in your ear. It has sensors for various volatiles, that's your nose. It has sensors for various sort of small soluble ligands, that's your tongue. It has sensors for contact, for heat, for body configuration. Okay, this is the brain. The body is another thing entirely. It has sensors for movement. Okay, those those are the vestibular organ in your ear. Okay, so all of these things are producing constant signals. Okay, so these things are sensors. Okay, and the problem is that you need to take all of this stuff in and survive, right? And ideally procreate as well. That's what evolutionary fitness is. So somehow all of that has to lead to some form of evolutionary fitness. Okay. And of course the reason the world's involved is that all of these things are coming from the world, and in some sense the world and your conspecifics and other living things in it determine the evolutionary fitness. Okay, and the brain sort of sits in this loop, right? All this stuff comes in, you have a motor system, Many would argue that the only reason you have a brain is because you have a motor system and it has to tell the motor system what to do. This is sort of the problem that we're trying to understand, right? How is it that you take all of these things, organize them in the way to choose the correct actions, both immediately, when you go out to reach out and pick up something, and on the longer term, you decide whether you're going to go to university or not, or who you're going to marry, all of these kinds of questions that have a much longer term impact on you. Okay, so this time scale is going to become important. These sorts of things have correlation lengths of, let's say, order of 100 milliseconds, or 10 milliseconds, to maybe tens of seconds. Okay? This is a lifetime in some sense, if we're actually talking about evolutionary fitness. Lifetimes of organisms, let's say somewhere on the order of a day to many years. Okay? And so, there's a lot that has to go on in here. It has to integrate up these signals, make decisions, as I said, that are going to have impact on sort of lifetime sorts of scales. And so in some sense what we want to do is we want to take these sensors and produce sense. Right? We need some sort of meaningful depiction of the consequences of actions and things that we want to be able to do. So that's our problem. Okay? Now, of course, actually doing things that integrate signals on this time scale and produce effects on this time scale as a primordial problem is going to be very hard. And the evolutionary solution is to try to contract those timescales to some degree. And so sort of built into here are going to be lots of internal sort of loops where small impacts on the world are going to lead to changes in the sensory input, and as we'll discuss later, some of those will be essentially some of the sort of cost function, if you like, or the objective function, which ultimately the evolutionary one was appropriate, have been transformed into internal objective functions that can be optimized in a much more local way. And a lot of the learning that we think about is about how those two things actually interact to shape our models of the world. All right, so this is kind of the problem. And I'll give you sort of short circuit, or I'll show you short circuit the results. So I've got a few slides in here because there are drawings I simply didn't want to commit to trying to make. Here we go, there's one. This is an excellent picture due to Ted Adelson at MIT. And what it's often referred to as an illusion. So there are two squares on it, labelled, I'll point on that screen, labelled A and B. Is there an old-fashioned stick somewhere? No, right, or wave. Maybe you can see the A, it's next to the green cylinder on the top, there's a B in the middle. Okay? And the question you might ask, or the question posed, is which one of those is the darker square? Okay. Most people will say A. Yep, everyone happy with that? Now, as you probably know if you've seen this before, if that question was a question about the photon flux, basically, from those two sides of the screen, the answer is no. They're actually exactly the same. But it's very, very hard to see that, actually. Right? So even though now that I've shown you that that's true, as you go back and look at it, A looks darker, it looks lighter. And that's because when your perceptual system looks at something like this, it's breaking it apart into an estimate of the state of the world, or at least that's one way of interpreting what's going on here. And so the question which is darker, you obligatorily interpret as a question about the albedo of that surface, about how many photons would be reflected from a real 3D surface illuminated in this way with all the shadow configuration, as opposed to a physical question about what is the what's the flux of photons that are actually coming in right now. And so in a sense, to do that, the argument would be that there's a very tight connection in the sense what the brain is doing in order to decide how to act well in the world is to use all of this information and organize it into a model of the world. Right? So that all of this stuff that comes in gets abstracted into a set of beliefs about the configuration of physical quantities. And actions are then based on those physical quantities. So that's sort of where we're going to start. We'll talk a little bit about how those sorts of things might arise and what kinds of principles Do interrupt. Questions. All right. Where do we go? Let's start off by. Let's check. Oh, that's right. I wanted to show this. So unless you're a fan of sort of 70s French animation, you probably haven't seen this still before. Nonetheless, for those of you maybe who can see it in some detail, it's a scene of entirely unfamiliar stuff, unlike the checkerboard and cylinders and things like that before. Nonetheless, you're perfectly able to parse it in the same way into a sort of representation of things. You can recognize when things are completely out of scale, so this is going to be very hard for those of you on the other side of the room to see, but somewhere in the bottom down there are figures that look, you would probably interpret as figures of people. And so there's a very, there's a lot of scale distortion, and you can recognize all of that, absorb it, and take it into account. So it's a very flexible representation of world states. And this is actually, in a sense, argue slightly against, or these sorts of phenomena, argue slightly against some of the ideas I'm going to push today, and that are in the title, the idea of statistical learning, because our ability to parse environments does sort of push the bounds of that statistical environment. There's a certain amount of extrapolation. And that's actually one of the features that seems to distinguish the sorts of learning that we're able to do and other animals are able to do from the sorts of things that machines are still able to do despite the phenomenal advances that we've seen in the last few years. All right, I think that we now go to black. Tell me what's coming next. All right. So let's start off by thinking about what it means to configure all of the connections, which is where we think most of the learning lives, within the brain, in order to be able to extract all of that information and build this model of the world. So the human brain has something like 10 to the 11 neurons. Neurons are the sort of primary information representation and processing unit of the brain. We are increasingly becoming aware that other cells in the brain are involved somehow in at least modulating that, but we'll still think about neurons for purposes of this. Almost all of those 10 to the 11 live here in the cerebellum. They're very, very simple, very small cells, and for our purposes won't count. So we're going to think about 10 to the 10 neurons. And that's the order of magnitude of the principal cells in the cerebral cortex. This thing up here, which must be more important because it's bigger. Okay. 10 to 10 neurons, in principle, right, that's something like 10 to the 20 possible connections. If everything could, in principle, so not actual connections, but possible, let's say potential. Okay, that's an awful lot of information if those need to be set to let's say there's 1 bit per connection, and I'm going to do a little bit of information counting here in an extraordinarily naive way. So let me just warn you, I'm going to entirely ignore the correlations in the signals beyond a few simple arguments about time length. So the entropies involved here will all be much smaller than anything I write down, and I'm going to hope that the degree to which they're smaller is the same when I count the capacity of the brain to learn and when I can count the entropy of the signals that it has to learn from. Okay? All right, so something like 10 to 20 possible connections. Let's see. In fact, each neuron makes more like 10 to the 4-ish connections, and so there are 10 to the 14 connections. Okay? And I'm going to assume, again, for the purposes of this talk, that that reduction has basically come from evolution. That comes from the genome. Okay? A lot of it is, a lot of the wiring of what neuron connects to what and what area is sort of built by a chemical cascade that is pretty fully determined by development that's genetically created. And that sort of seems reasonable in the sense that the genome, just look at the coding regions and again ignore the fact that there are sort of codons, redundant codons for different amino acids in it and things like that. Just do the raw count of, I think it's what, half times 10 to the 8, 10 to the 6 base pairs, and then you've got 2 bits per base pair, so something like 10 to the 8 bits. Okay, so that's 10 to the 6, maybe sort of working. If this kind of space is not a subtraction, we're actually shaping things using this much information. We can get down to about 10. So these, we think in the context of an individual, to a large extent, need to be set by the environment. They need to actually be determined by the experience of the animal coming in. Now this is an incredibly hand-wavy calculation. I'm sure all of the experts in the area will say that's far too large a number. It's really going to be much more than that. But it just gives you a feeling for the fact that it's very hard to see how development, even given the sort of information richness available in the genome, can actually lead to something that solves the sort of problem over here. And again, one of the reasons that we don't need 10 to 14 is there are many solutions that are going to be equally good, right? And then there may indeed be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of solutions. That can take many orders of magnitude down. All right, but nonetheless, we're going to think about how these sorts of numbers might be set by the environment. And there's been, this is sort of the counting argument. There's also experimental, plenty of biological experimental evidence. You raise animals in different environments, you get different connections and different functional responses that, in the neurons after that. Here's an example of statistical learning drawn from some of the coordinators of this particular session. So what they did was to ask people to observe passively. This is where I really need it for a second. From over here. Right, so up here, for those again who can see this, sorry, the mechanics of this have worked out not ideally. What you can see, there are a bunch of little glyphs. Let me see if I can draw some of this. So you see little sort of symbols, sort of space invader-y symbols that appear in particular patterns. So here we've got triangle, square, and circle. They have much more complicated things. Here you have X, plus, and circle again. They didn't overlap. And they build up scenes out of these different glyphs. Okay? And because these have multiple elements within them, when you build up scenes using all of these, there's some statistics in the set of scenes that are possible. Okay? And those go beyond just pairwise co-occurrence statistics. They're sort of richer. Thank you. Which side am I supposed to point to? All right, those are the glyphs. These are the scenes. And there's some statistics just because of the way that these things are created. And so now what you do is you just let people look at these for a while, and then you pop up a couple of choices. These are too small for anyone to look at, but one of them is essentially consistent with, I've trimmed the bottom of these, haven't I? One of these is entirely consistent with one of the underlying tiles that went into it. The other one has a change in the tile. And you ask them which one of these is more consistent with all of the scenes that you've been looking at for a while. And the people, who are in grey, do pretty well. Okay. If you, I'm going to have to rely on these guys who actually did the experiment in a moment. Maybe let me try to take a simple description of this. If you basically ask people what's the to recognize a consistent glyph from one that's not, people can do pretty well. If you create a fake one that is consistent, that's, I guess, equally consistent, and they don't do so well, but if it's consistent on just in second order statistics, but breaks the higher order statistics, they're still able to do pretty well. Yes? On the other hand, if you build just a simple pairwise associative estimator to do this, it fails to recognize the fact that the thing that has the right second order statistics is violated at third order by construction in essence. Whereas something that actually is trying to extract structure from the world, here labeled a Bayesian causal learner, I guess, is able to find that structure successfully, just like the people can. Okay, so this is a simple example, and there are many of these over the years that have suggested that we are able, even as adults, to capture some of the statistical structure if it changes. And as we just heard actually in the session this morning, these sorts of ideas, this sort of capacity is much richer in developing animals and juveniles. Okay. Blank again. All right. So this is our counting. This is our argument, both from a counting point of view and from a experimental point of view, that we use this kind of statistical knowledge to get somewhere. How? Right? What is the process by which this can be done? So here I'm going to lean very heavily on in my terminology, on an area of computer science called machine learning. It's what you've seen these days, kind of driving a lot of the phenomena that people have now labeled AI, artificial intelligence. But it's basically a computer way to learn, or an algorithmic way to learn from statistics. A lot of that work relies on what you might think of as, or what is called supervised learning, okay? Which is where, in essence, there's a function that takes us from some input, that's something like our sensory information, to a desired output. Okay? So there's usually labeled y, very simple. And given a number of examples of input and output, we need to learn the function. Now, from the point of view of this entire loop, the only actual output that we have in this kind of very primordial setting, where all I have is inputs in the brain, and I'm trying to maximize evolutionary fitness, is basically whether I actually manage to survive past the point where I had children. Right? So I get one bit of information, no good. So instead, we think of two different mechanisms that feed in. I'm going to come back to supervised learning because there's things we can learn from it nonetheless. But for now, as an actual structure of what happens overall in this kind of primordial setting, it doesn't really make sense. The second one is that we create internal goals. Okay? Or I'm going to call them rewards. And we know this is true from biological measurements. So there's many signals that are creating essentially internal states. They're usually associated, many of them associated with the 4 Fs, feeding, fleeing, fighting, and procreation. And these essentially all create very intrinsic signals that basically close this loop. And they come along much more often than once per lifetime. Okay? And so these create signals somewhere, let's say on the order of seconds. And so again, making the horrible assumption that everything is independent over time, we can call this something like 10 to the 8 bits. This helps, it's very important, but it's still quite short of 1 bit per connection. And so the other source of information is essentially what I just showed you, is the statistical regularity in the world in the inputs. Statistics of inputs. And so learning from these we refer to as unsupervised. In the sense that the learning system is basically trying to essentially construct worlds out of those inputs without any guidance as to what output it should have in particular. Sorry, I'm just going to make that X a bit bigger, because it's a no. Whereas which, given these inputs, it will help it to shape what this reinforcement signal, or how to achieve higher values of reward of reinforcement, ultimately to achieve, through the kind of process of evolutionary search, achieve something like close to evolutionary fitness. Okay, so that's our structure. That's sort of a cascade of different learning schemes. And I'm going to spend some time talking about this unsupervised version before we go back up and talk about subjects. Okay, I've talked about experiments. Maybe let me make one other point here. Okay, so how is it that these two things, or indeed these three things, might ultimately be linked? And so here we're going to sort of take an absence. Okay, so here's a picture that we might often draw. That's your brain. These are all the variables that your brain stores. Okay. This is the sensory input. There are many of these, and I'm going to label those X, as I have. Okay, that's a Z up there. There is a action, this choice of what you do in the world right now. This thing comes down, it affects the world, there's all the squiggles on it, goes back up, creates new inputs, okay, and these then feed into our state, set t plus 1, and of course there's some persistence. The brain is a dynamical system, and so some persistence there. There's also, of course, some persistence in the world over this time scale as well. So this is sort of a time scale, think of things on the order of maybe 100 milliseconds or so. This thing goes on, right? At the end of the chain, basically, you die. But along the way, as I said, you're getting these rewards, right? So, I'm going to draw a little coin. Okay, so these are your little coins, these are your rewards that are coming in. So whether we think of this as the objective or these as the objectives, what you're essentially, the system is trying to extract a representation from here such that it can choose actions to increase the likelihood of whatever outcome you want over here. Which means that the information necessary to actually do that calculation needs to be captured in these variables that the brain has extracted. And that's sort of the driving force of this kind of statistical learning. And so formally, what we would write is we would say that there is a quantity Q, which is a function of the action. Okay? And I would like to make this quantity Q independent of the inputs X conditioned on all of these latent variables Z. And so what this statement makes, this is an objective, and it's an objective we could use for learning. And what the statement says is, you can think of it as a bottleneck. All the information that links these two things, because of course the value of the action does depend on the state of the world, has to be captured somehow in all the stuff that's in the brain. Okay, so this is a learning objective that we might write down to try to capture the whole big learning problem. And now here's the ansatz. So the problem with this, of course, is that the consequences, the information I get about this value, lie far into the future. And there's an entire field of reinforcement learning that tries to get around that problem and bring information back. And much of it involves actually literally back propagating through time. It's quite hard to do these things effectively in an online way. But it can be done in a lot of settings, and it indeed looks like the brain does do a lot of that as well. But the ansatz is that I can also ask, so I drew deliberately many different circles here. They correspond to different elements of all of this sensory stuff coming in. And so our ansatz is that the same set of variables that makes the consequences of the future independent of the input will also make different elements of the input independent. Okay? And so I can transfer something that has a complicated temporal dependence into something where the temporal dependence is much more confined. And I can try to look for explanations of the sensory world alone, where what an explanation is it's something that, again, captures the fact that different parts of my sensory experience do not occur independently. But if I can capture that information into these latent variables, and into these variables in the brain, then what's left is as independent as possible. Okay? And this is sort of a driving force in some way behind a lot of our thinking and our supervised learning, both as we use it to model biological systems and also the way we build algorithms to actually learn these things in computers.
How are the correlations built into this?
So that's the key question, is what is the nature of each of these links? So I'm going to start off by showing you some work, a couple of pieces of work from the 90s that have, these are basically linear, they're really, really simple. We'll reach the end of that path, and then I'll talk about what people's use. Okay, so let me actually skip the next thing, which was about the importance of. So one of the things that I care a lot about in this big picture is the fact that the values here are not going to be determined exactly. There's going to be uncertainty associated with them, and we don't understand well how it is that the biological system is able to handle that uncertainty and represent it. I just skipped a few slides showing one use of the uncertainty in behavior, but I think that's a side point for most of what I want to talk about. All right, so let's get on to specific models. So as I said, the simplest models end up being linear. I'm going to think about them or show them to you in the context of of basically image models. So this is an image, and we're going to think of a set of variables. These are our variables, Z1, Z2, so on. This thing over here is our x. This is our image that we're trying to model. And the very simplest thing says that our image is just a sum over the different internal variables of some basis function which I'm going to give to this the same dimensions as the image, but you can also think of it perhaps as a little region within the image. Okay, just times this. Okay, so that's a link between x and z. But to have a full model that we can actually use to model the data statistically, I also need to know what the distribution of z is. Okay, and the class of models. So if this is linear, I assume perhaps that there's some measurement noise, which I'm going to assume to be Gaussian. If I also choose z to have a normal distribution, so the first thing one would write down, the system is entirely unidentifiable. I can rotate z, change my phi's, I get exactly the same probability of the data. So to make this identifiable, in the simplest case, we need for this thing to have a non-Gaussian distribution, and most commonly it's chosen to have a sparse, a high kurtosis distribution. For the same variance, you're much more likely to see either very small or very large values than you would with a Gaussian. So that's a very simple idea. It's a very simple model. It was first applied in practice to a set of images whose statistics were something like the natural statistics. I think the first set was actually a bunch of maybe Bruno Alsassen's holiday photographs. People got very excited because these basis functions, phi, that you learn when you basically maximize the probability of these holiday photographs under a model that looks as simple as this, look like this. Okay, so these are, so the way you compose an image in this picture is you pick the set of sparse z coefficients, you multiply each z by a corresponding one of these little patches, and then you add them all together. Right? And that's the recipe for creating images. There's terrible recipes you would expect for creating images. That's the best you can do with this kind of model. And what you get are these little stripy, sort of small regions of black and white, which excited people because if you go to the primary visual cortex and you basically measure how cells, specific cells in the primary visual cortex, called simple cells, respond to contrast, light or dark contrast, as a function of its position on the retina, you get pictures that look like these two over here, these two cells that were measured, and they are very well approximated by these two mathematical functions, which are Gabor wavelets. So these are plane waves that are modulated by a Gaussian envelope in 2D space. And so there's a remarkable correspondence between what this very, very simple model produces and this sort of first layer of processing, at least at the level of the cerebral cortex in cats and primates, is where these things are conducted. So that got people very excited. There was something that we could do, even with this very, very simple model, that actually resembled measurements that we can make in the brain. And so then people tried to, we started as a community to try to push forward the envelope of this. Am I running for 45 or for an hour? What's my time?
You can finish in about 10 minutes.
Okay, so what can I do with this? Well, one piece of the puzzle that's clearly missing is the fact that if I do try to compose an image in this way, out of these little Gabor wavelets, images don't tend to have sort of immediately stationary statistics over the entire visual field. Right? So if I look in different parts of an image, I'll have a lot of very blank stuff in the sky, perhaps, unless it's a particularly tempestuous day. I'll have maybe other regions of very high frequency, very fine resolution. And so you might imagine that there should be some structure amongst these variables. Instead of drawing them independently one of each other, I can say that was the implicit picture over here, I should have something to them. And one very simple form of structure is just a covariation in the variance of these distributions. And in fact, I can construct one of these distributions in the first place actually by taking Gaussian variable z, but scaling the variance randomly and choosing the variance from, in this case it would be a gamma distribution to get a student t distribution kind of structure for this thing over here. Okay, so I can construct these things with Gaussians modulated in their scale and their variance, so people call this a Gaussian scale mixture. And you can do that, and you discover a couple of things. One is that I didn't say this, but I can describe this as a generative model, a way to go from z to x. There's an equivalent, what we call a recognition model, something that takes an image and estimates the values of the z's. For these very simple linear models, it's almost just take the matrix formed of all of these basis functions and transpose it, depending on whether they're orthogonal or not. And so I can basically look to filter an image with a couple of these different Gabor wavelets. And if you do that, as pointed out by Martin Wainwright, Adelia Schwartz, and Eros Micheli, you actually get a structure where indeed the covariance of neighboring values is correlated. So you can see that in this bow tie histogram plot. What this is showing is a histogram of the value of one of these as a function of the value of the other. And you can see that they're uncorrelated, but as one goes up in magnitude, the other one also goes up in magnitude. And so that can be corrected by this scale kind of process. And so if now you do the recognition side of the scaling process, which is basically you sum up a lot of the values of a local set of these things and you just divide out the factors, so you correct for the scale, then you create something that looks much more independent. Okay, so this sort of pushed us towards something that was that, sort of closer to the generative process that we were assuming in the first place. And the second thing you can do is you can do a sort of similar idea of persistence or of correlation in magnitude. Now, rather than in space, you can do it over time. And if you do that, then, and again, I'll perhaps not try to explain this for the sake of time. Let me just say, if you do that, then you can get there are many other aspects. For example, the fact that these basis functions seem to appear in little groups that have a particular relationship between them that can be captured by that kind of model where you're looking for temporal persistence as well as spatial persistence. So these linear models with a few dozen whistles were encouraging because they seem to recapitulate some very, very basic features, at least of the very first stages of cortical visual processing. Okay?
Maneesh?
Yes.
So I'm confused about something.
Yes.
When you first wrote in your last panel that the Z's generate actions, I thought that these Z's were brain latent variables.
Yep.
But now you're telling us that these Z's are latent variables for the generative model of natural images, for instance.
Yep.
So if I put these two things together, are you saying that the brain learns the statistics of the X's by acquiring the generative model, by learning the Z's? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, thank you, exactly. That's what I tried to say in these rather complicated symbols over here.
Okay.
The same, this is the answer, the same variable Z that create this action conditional independence, so they carry all the information necessary to predict the quality of an action, are the ones that make different parts of the visual environment, or sensory environment, conditionally independent. So in these models, what we're saying is different pixels of the image are being explained, or the correlation between the different, or the structure in the different pixels is explained by the latent variables, and everything that's left is conditionally independent.
But those are the variables that the brain learns, not the X. It learns about the statistics of the X's through learning the
a representation.
Z variables.
Exactly. Okay. Where are we? Okay. So that was very encouraging. And then, of course, we hit a brick wall, as we do in very many data-rich sciences, which is we need to go from linear to nonlinear. Okay. And so this is a picture I've cribbed from Dan Yeamans and Jim DiCarlo, both at MIT at the time, down south Stanford. And reflects clearly statistical learning doesn't work in some settings, or at least I guess motor action learning. This is now a primate brain, which is why it doesn't, a non-human primate brain, that's why it doesn't look like mine. This is a recent cut. And this is a sort of schematic of the many stages of processing in the visual pathways that have been teased out over many, many years. Signals come in from the retina over here, through a stage of processing in the middle of the brain, called the thalamus, and then come up into cortical areas. So that's the cerebral cortex, this large part that I've decided to count. But there are still many stages of processing that seem to be arranged broadly in a hierarchy, although with connections that flow both ways in that hierarchy. Okay, but there are fewer short circuits to hop the hierarchy than you might imagine. Drawn below is a sort of circa mid, I guess 2010-ish artificial neural network used for image processing, usually for sort of image categorization, for example. And it's not an accident that there are many features of this processing cascade which actually seem to resemble, at least at the baseline, the kinds of processing features that we see in the visual system, and that's because much of the thinking about these sorts of structures was informed by people looking at the visual system maybe back in the early 80s. Okay, so what these guys did was they pointed out the following fact, which is quite remarkable in many ways, which is that if you take this thing down here, which is now a supervised network, I've erased my supervision, but it was trained using images, broadly natural images, or at least the kinds of things you can find on the web, to produce an output which was a label of at least one of the objects that's present in that image. Okay? but it does so with an architectural kind of cascade, which has some inspiration from what we have observed over many years in the field. And you now do the following experiment. You take exactly the same image, you show it to a primate, abuse it. It doesn't, I think, in this experiment actually do anything with that information. You just measure the response of the neuronal activity as it goes on. You now run the same image through the network already trained to do the classification. You don't change it anymore. And you now seek to relate the variable values at different points in this cascade of processing to the measurements that you make of neuronal activity in response to the same image. There's a remarkable correspondence between those two things. In fact, if you want to predict what a cell in the middle of this cascade will do in response to an image, certainly at the time, and this is still pretty much true, the best predictor you can get is to take one of these artificial neural networks and learn to do a very simple linear mapping from the appropriate intermediate stage to the appropriate intermediate brain stage. And what this points to is the fact that if we have a supervised learning problem, we know how to handle this multi-layer cascade of nonlinear systems. But it also helps to highlight the fact that this is a stage of prediction and a relationship deep into the visual processing hierarchy that we weren't able to achieve, sort of taking this idea as it stood literally. Okay, I at least still find it relatively unsatisfying that we're able to find this correspondence, because there's an enormous search space that defines all of these things, and that search hasn't really been done. Okay, it's been very haphazard. And indeed, you could say the same thing of almost all of machine learning and AI. The architectures that you hear about today, transformers and diffusion models and all the sorts of things that you can look at, we stumbled across them. And the problem of actually looking for the architectural, searching through that architectural space is too vast. It's something we just don't know how to do well. Okay, so these things are slightly dissatisfying. I guess in the last couple of minutes, let me just say where different subgroups within our community have been trying to push from here in the last little while. So one idea is to take the structures that we have in these sorts of models, but rather than thinking about the details of the end state of learning, think about the dynamical process of setting all of the weights that live within this network. Now, it turns out that the dynamics are very interesting. You can actually extract a lot of those dynamics by dropping all the non-linearities but keeping the hierarchy. And what that highlights, because I just multiply a whole bunch of matrices together, getting just another matrix, is that these systems are very over-parameterized. There's many more numbers that specify one of these artificial cascades than are necessary to specify a function. And so that over-parameterization leads to symmetries in the problem. And basically the result of that is that the learning process involves a whole series of breakings of symmetries. And so the learning process actually has a sort of a series of abrupt plateaus and development over time that in many ways, you can find evidence resemble the sorts of things that you can, that animals and people go through. But also, that process of symmetry breaking tends to funnel certain pieces of information into particular layers of the process. Okay, and so that gives us now a handle, perhaps, on trying to understand why it is that different bits of information show up in different parts of hierarchies like this, but still in a purely supervised training setting. So we're using a sort of a separate artificial objective function from the one that would be available to the brain itself, but we can still learn something from it and it can still be useful. The other direction to go in is to use, again, adopt techniques. I think I do have a picture of this, but not so important. Oh, that's right, I do want to show this though. This is very important. There's a lot of hype, there's always hype. This is a figure of something called the perceptron, actually a photograph of something called a perceptron. The perceptron was a physical object with lots of wires and potentiometers. And that was developed around the 1950s. This is what the news wires wanted to say about it. The Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer today that it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. The embryo, the Weather Bureau's $2 million 704 computer, learned to differentiate between right and left after 50 attempts. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. All right. So yes, where do we go with hype? So what we are also trying to do now is use, again, things that have been inspired by thinking in the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence to try to pin down more about these objective functions and the cascaded learning. So another idea that as I mentioned there is to take this notion of bottleneck that I described quite seriously, but now think about bottlenecks in time. One example, but just between the inputs x. So rather than this conditional independence between x at time t, I, and j, I have x at time t and time t plus 1. And so those bottlenecks can be made very explicit. This is an algorithm called contrastive predictive coding. And these are also able, out of time, so these are also able to capture some certain elements, in this case, in the paper that I drew these from, the separation of information into two streams, which seem to be associated with paths in the brain, some of which run dorsally and some of which run ventrally. Although, in fact, they did this, the comparison here was done to the mouse brain. And then the final direction is one where we're actually trying to go back to these probabilistic models of this ilk, but using a little bit of extra maths, but mostly, again, inspiration from what we've been able to do in the artificial intelligence world, to think about schemes where we're still able to learn with a probabilistic objective function, these conditional independence ideas, and maximizing likelihoods, but do so where we now have much more complicated nonlinearity sitting inside there. And that's something that we, I think, over the last little while, have started to be able to build practical systems that are able to do. And I'll end, I think, with one picture from one of those. So this now is the same patch idea. Ignore the graph, I won't go through that, don't have time to go through that. Same patch idea, we're just going to try to build a model of the patches, but now they're nonlinear, and the model, the generative model is nonlinear, and it's going to be seeded not by these variables z, but basically by a sort of categorical type variable. And when you do that, and you look to see what sorts of things are associated with a given type, you get exactly the sort of description of an image that I tried to paint in words before. The most common type is a bunch of cloudy skies. You then have a type, these were done on a particular data set of natural images, or I think images with foliage and buildings. The next set is very dense foliage. Somewhere else you get things that are basically stripes of buildings. But now these are the building blocks that a system, nonlinear building blocks that a system has identified that can be composed together, and that look like the sorts of textual elements that another line of biological work has identified as things that mid parts of the visual system can identify. All right, so let me stop there. But this is sort of the project. This is what we're trying to do, is bring together these ideas of learning statistics around algorithms, relate those to what we can measure in the brain, and so make sense of this gap between the information that the genome can provide to this object and that of the environment.
Thank you. Questions? Quite an audience.
So, the evidence for the point that you're trying to make is pretty convincing when we look at the visual system. But as I move down the list, do you feel equally confident as I go through other sensory systems that are not vision, that this idea of latent variables encoded by the brain being the generative model, do you think they still hold?
So, sorry. Personally, I'm quite happy with that model for sound, both from experimental evidence. So a priori, I'm going to skip the chemicals for a moment. I'll come back to those. I think that, so actually body configuration and these sorts of things are an excellent example. I would argue that the ability to learn to embody a tool and use it is exactly evidence of this kind of process going on. Right?
You would argue, like my colleague Leo Kavanagh used to say, convincingly, although not rigorously.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had 45 minutes. Yeah. I'm happy to write down more. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the fact that you steer a car without thinking in hand movement coordinates, you think about it in kind of direction of steering coordinates, right? Is something like this. Yeah, I agree. Chemicals are hard. Like actually thinking about a generative process there.
So just following up on that, it's interesting to note that chemicals are probably the earliest evolutionarily. So
yeah. So I think certain things that probably come from the chemicals. So some of the early phenomena, I suspect, had more to do with directionality, and so their generative models of plumes and things like that are important and probably are part of the statistical learning. I mean, there's also so people do think about olfaction, for example. So the volatile side of these things, in terms of there being sort of specific sources of odorants in particular concentrations, exactly how those are recovered, how you learn about the space of all of these, and how you do the inference. So hidden in all of this, I've talked about learning and acquiring all of these things, but of course the goal of learning in any setting like this is actually to be able to make this transformation, to take inputs and make an estimate of what's going on in the brain, and that's what I refer to as inference. Exactly how that inference is done, and you know, how dynamic it is, how much you need, varying concentrations of the different odorants over time, I think is something that I'm not an expert in olfaction, but I think is part of the thinking about whether these progressive models can actually apply to olfaction. If my colleague Peter Latham were here, I'm sure he'd be banging me over the head because he thinks about olfaction in that way a lot.
I have a question, which is mental health conditions, for example, must help reveal some of these, where maybe some of these don't work or work differently. Yep. Is there any good examples?
So a lot of where there's been, I think, credible connections, and actually other people in the here will know a lot more about this than me. I think where there's been sort of credible evidence supporting the idea that we can interpret failures or mental health issues as in this sort of computational framework tend to lie in this. I've got this kind of reinforcement pathway, the recreated internal signals of motivation that then guide learning, and so many of them. Many of those are associated with specific neuromodulator pathways. So these are chemicals that modify kind of large-scale computation across large areas in the brain, and sort of you can think of them as almost scalar signals rather than the very high-dimensional vector-like representations that we have in other neurons. And those things like dopamine, serotonin, sort of histamines, norepinephrine. These are all released under different circumstances, and changes in how those are released or in their uptake or in their expressiveness are often associated with different kinds of mental health issues. There's been some, so I guess particularly in psychosis and the idea of hallucinations, there's been some thinking about that as actually a false construction of latent state from this kind of information, but I think tying that together so far has been a little bit more difficult.
Is there a question? Sarah?
Yes, what about movement related to injuries? So imagine somebody gets injured, the brain has to relearn to do certain motions that was perfectly comfortable with before but can no longer do. Is there any kind of statistical modeling of that, or?
I'm not aware of statistical modeling of it. One thing that was pointed out actually by somebody just this morning was that there is a lot of evidence that as much practice as you possibly can have helps. And so, one attempt has been to force people to use the affected limb, for example, if the right arm is affected, not the left. They will default to using the one that's been saved, that's been spared. Force them to use the other, and they will recover that much faster. There is so we actually have a clinical fellow, a consultant doctor in the UK, who's just joining our unit, partly to look at exactly these sorts of issues.
Because that's an interesting case where the brain used to know how to do something, but has to relearn from scratch.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that.
So I think it's certainly very interesting. I mean, you know, usually the way we've lost movement is through something relatively focal, right? So it's a stroke or something like that in one particular place. The pathway that actually guides and controls movement has many different pieces to it. And so part of that process is going to be finding ways to replace that one piece while ideally using as much of the rest of that pathway as has been spared. But I think a lot of medicine still in this field, very complicated system, a lot of it is actually not the way I describe the machine learning, right? You find something, it works, you go with it. And it's very, very hard to explore. It's very hard to know that what we're doing is actually the best possible thing.
Okay, thank you so much.